What's up, everybody, and welcome back to In Search of Answers, the series where you ask me questions and I do my very best to answer them. I've got some really fun ones to get into that I'm really excited to sort of dig into some of these today. But first, if you have the War Within beta, I have started up a cross-faction community that you can join, especially if you are on the level 80 server, the These Go to 11 server that they have, where you're able to make level 80 characters. I've put together a cross-faction community that we can use for things like on Thursday this week, for example. I'll be doing a live stream over on my Twitch stream where I'll be doing dungeons with viewers. So that'll be how you can get into that. It'll also be just generally a good way to hang out and find other people to do some content with if you'd like. So if you'd like to join that beta community, all you have to do in the description here on YouTube, there will be a invite code essentially. And you just open up your guild/communities panel inside of the War Within beta client. You click join a community, you just paste that code in there and click OK. And that will automatically enter you into the community and you will join automatically. There's no need to wait for like a sign up or anything. It is basically open invitation. You can also find it by just searching for Sounds Good through the actual browser if you want, but the invite code is a little bit easier. So recommend using that method. Anyway, let's get into today's questions. The first one for today comes from Dead and Cold, who said, the gaming industry seems to be subject to different genres exploding in popularity for a few years, and everyone rushing to make one before dying down before something else exploding. Like ages ago, FPSs became massive, then MMOs, then MOBAs, then survival games, battle royales, team shooters, etc. From my view, we seem to be in one of the between lulls. What do you think will be the next big boom? Will it be something new, or will one of the previous booms make a comeback? So if you've been watching any of the game announcements that have happened over the last few weeks, last couple weeks especially, it's kind of starting to become clear what at least one of the next big booms we're going to see is, and the next, like, everyone's making one of these sort of experiences we're going to have, and that is the hero shooter. We're seeing so many of these being announced. Valve just announced a new one called Deadlock that they're working on. Obviously, Marvel Rivals is being worked on, which is basically just Overwatch with Marvel characters. There's another one that it was actually announced a while ago, but more recently has been getting some traction called Concord that people are starting to notice and take note of. We're just seeing a lot of these sort of team-based hero shooters coming into fruition and coming into existence. That definitely seems like at least one of the current booms that's coming forward in the next, like, everyone's making one of these sort of situations. But I think it's important actually to step back a little bit from exactly what the next big boom is here and try to understand a little bit more about why this happens, because that will help to identify a few other things that I think we should be keeping our eyes on and potentially going to start seeing a surge of in the near future. So there's a few reasons that this can occur, but kind of one of the biggest factors is someone makes a game, that game does well, and then a bunch of other developers say, hey, that's a good idea, but we think we can do it in some different way, or we just want to jump on the train, or so on and so forth. And they will then start to make something along those lines. Another way that it can happen is literally no one has made a game like this in a while, but here's a new idea that maybe we'll start to go in that direction. And then that will start to push people in making that sort of thing as well. And the reason that I mentioned those two different methods of why that will occur is because I think it's important and it's useful to explore that from the specific hero shooter line of thinking. Because Overwatch was a game that came along and it was kind of like the first hero shooter in a while. There hadn't really been others that had been made relatively recently and in that general time frame. But it was one that came along and a whole bunch of people then took that idea and they were like, okay, we're going to make this same sort of game. We're going to come out with a game that's similar in this concept to Overwatch. And I think it's important to understand, like, games take time to develop. So the other hero shooters that came alongside Overwatch, when Overwatch was first released, there was a bunch of others that came along, like Paladins, Battleborn. There were a few other hero shooters that had very similar vibes to Overwatch and very similar, like, you pick a character and then you're playing that character with that character's abilities inside a team deathmatch sort of situation. There were a lot of games that all came out right in that same sort of general time frame from each other. And it's important to understand that those games didn't appear because of Overwatch, right? The ones that came out at least within like the same year as Overwatch or within the same like span of several months, those games were in development before Overwatch was announced. They would have had to have been because games take longer than that to develop. That there's a time period where you're working on a game and then eventually that game comes out. So the games like Battleborn, the games like Paladins, I don't think those games were made to copy Overwatch. Now, they probably took a lot of notes from Overwatch and maybe made some adjustments after they had seen the announcement. There's always the possibility that they saw the announcement and say, hey, we're making kind of a similar game, but let's, because of what we're seeing with Overwatch, let's make a couple of changes to what we're working on because we haven't fully announced yet, blah, blah, blah. They were able to make some adjustments. I fully expect that sort of thing is going to happen. But those games didn't come about, like they didn't start working on Battleborn because of Overwatch. It is my theory at the very least. I haven't been able to confirm that exactly, but that's my guess based on how long it takes to develop a video game. So the concept of this is a bunch of people all decided roughly around the same time, hey, a hero shooter would be a good idea. Now, what the catalyst for that is, I don't actually know. I don't remember well enough exactly what had been going on in the years prior to Overwatch coming along. In fact, Overwatch is an interesting sort of example of this anyway, because Overwatch was actually made by canceling another game. So Blizzard was working on a game called Titan that was meant to be this MMO FPS sort of thing. And that was a game where they went, okay, we have to scrap most of this. This game is not coming together. They literally were like, this game isn't very good, but what can we salvage from this? And what they salvaged was they made a hero shooter. They took what they had and they were like, okay, this part of the game is fun. Let's make that into a full, complete game. And that's where Overwatch came about. As to where the other ones came along, it could literally have been something like, hey, you remember Team Fortress 2? There hasn't been a game like Team Fortress 2 in a while, so let's come up with what a modern version of Team Fortress 2 might be like. And multiple people might have had that idea all around the same time. That's the sort of thing that can occur. Then that also led into Overwatch being released. And I think the ones that we're now seeing, the Marvel Rivals, Deadlock, Concord, etc., I think we are seeing those as the ones that someone saw Overwatch and went, hey, okay, hold on, maybe we'll make a game like that at some point. That could have been the case where, like, especially after Overwatch 2 had kind of a mixed reception, it could be the case that they saw Overwatch 2 was kind of floundering a little bit and went, okay, hold on, actually, now there's opportunity for us to make one of these. Let's make one of those games, and so on. So that's kind of the couple of different ways of why these sorts of groups of people, like, because it ends up being multiple studios all having the same thought at the same time, and that leads to the glut of these games coming out. It does happen, but it's not as common and it's not as widespread as people think it is, where a game comes out and immediately 3 other studios try to make a copy of that game and cobble it together as quickly as possible. Like, obviously that does happen, and there are examples of that occurring many times throughout gaming history. But more commonly, when you see this big surge of games, it's because somebody had an idea a while ago, and a bunch of developers and a bunch of different development teams saw that idea and went, oh, that's a cool idea. I'm going to start working on one of those. And so then several years later is when you actually see the results of that one game coming out and having the interesting things and having people get excited about that. Which is why I think there's a couple of upcoming trends. There's some that are already sort of in progress that I think are worth calling out here. And there's some that I think we can look forward to in the future based on some current trends and current successful products that we've seen more recently. So hero shooters, we've already talked about a little bit. Another one that's relatively similar, kind of in the same vein. And we're sort of almost like halfway through this boom at this point, I think. That would be the extraction shooter or the extraction style of gameplay. There are a couple of other projects that I'm aware of. One of them, I don't actually know if I'm under NDA or not. I got into an early playtest for a game. I don't know if it's under NDA or not, so I'm not going to talk about it in detail. But there's one that it's not a shooter, but it still uses that extraction style gameplay. And these are kind of the evolution of battle royales, evolution of hero shooters. It's kind of going in its own direction into a different thing. These are the Tarkovs, the Dark and Darkers. And these are the games that we're now starting to see came from people who saw Tarkov years ago, went, hey, that's a cool idea, but I would like to make a game that is that, but I've got ways to improve on the formula or different ideas of how to approach it and so on. Like Dark and Darker being an example of one where they saw Tarkov and they went, hey, that's cool, but what if it was like swords and spells and sorcery and like a sort of medieval fantasy sort of vibe about it? That's where Dark and Darker came from. Some that we're seeing that are coming up soon. There's Marathon, which is the one coming from Bungie that is sort of a revival of their old first-person shooter franchise from ages ago. There's some questions about what's going on in Bungie right now. There was some layoffs recently and some articles that were kind of concerning about like the internal workings of Bungie. I don't know enough about that to comment any beyond just it's something to think about and something to keep an eye on. So future of Marathon is somewhat, I don't think we can be confident that that one is going to have the best development environment or maybe not even come to fruition, but that's a little bit doomsaying. I'm not going to worry about that too much. Marathon is one of these extraction games that's being worked on, and hopefully we'll get to play at some point. There's another one that was just announced called Level Zero Extraction. That one looks kind of interesting. Apparently, EVE Online, they're working on one called EVE Vanguard, which is a first-person shooter extraction style gameplay as well. And like I said, there's some that I know of that are being worked on that are not actually first-person shooter, but they try to take that concept of extraction style gameplay and put it towards other sort of formats, other sort of genres, like ARPG sort of stuff and things along those lines. Another one that we're kind of in the midst of the boom right now is, it's very different from what you see otherwise, but it's the concept of like the cozy game. We've been seeing a lot of games that just trying to hit that cozy vibe more recently. And these can be all over the place. Like the actual idea of what a cozy game is doesn't, like, cozy isn't a genre necessarily. It's more just a vibe. It's more just a development approach or philosophy that changes a lot of how you would approach a game. Typically speaking, these are games that have little to no combat whatsoever. They're oftentimes focused around things like farming or like crafting or working on, like, there's a game that you make potions and you sell potions. These are things like Farming Simulator, which has been around for a while but has gotten a surge in popularity relatively recently. These are where the like Supermarket Simulator, that sort of games start to come in. Is these are games that are meant to just kind of be like Little Kitty Big City is another one of these relatively recently. These are games that they're all about the vibes and they're all about that sort of relaxation element of gaming, less so the like, oh my God, we're going to get the adrenaline pumping, and more about that mindset of I'm doing this just to chill out and relax because the world is complicated and sometimes having a video game as a way to relax is a good sort of escape from that. So that's been a trend that's been going on for a while. And still continues to be popular. We're still seeing that to continue to rise in popularity, that approach to video games. Another one that I want to call out as a potential one that we're going to see in the near future, and we've started to see a little bit trending towards this, is horror, actually, completely on the opposite, the opposite end of the spectrum from cozy games. Horror has started to come back around. And there are two games that I attribute a lot of that to in very recent times that has really gotten people scratching their heads and really gotten game designers thinking about horror again. And for very different reasons. The two games that I want to call out for this are Alan Wake 2 and Lethal Company. And you might not put those two in the same genre. They definitely are very different in terms of gameplay. But when you think about horror, they both had this interesting approach to it that wasn't really so, like, it's not necessarily the newest thing ever, but it was interesting enough how they utilized horror elements in those two games that it's now gotten people thinking about them a little bit differently. I'll start with Lethal Company. This was a game made by a guy who used to make Roblox games. In fact, I don't actually know that that's the right pronoun. So a developer that used to make Roblox games decided to make Lethal Company, and it blew up. It got super incredibly popular, and they're continuing to make updates for it, continuing to expand on it, and hopefully making a lot of money off of it. It's certainly been one of the top sellers on Steam for several weeks. Not currently, but there have been several weeks where it was the top seller on Steam. And that's one that I'm considering like co-op comedy horror is how I would describe that, where yes, like there are horror elements. There are moments where you get scared and run away from things. There are moments where you go, oh God, oh God, oh God, we got to get out of here. But it's from the, like, we're going to be scared for a moment and then we're going to laugh about that immediately afterwards. It's not meant to be like a, pull the covers up, leave the nightlight on sort of horror experience. It's more of a like give you a brief scare so that you like run and panic for a moment. And then you're doing this with your friends. So it's the shared experience and you are able to laugh about it afterwards. Oftentimes laughing at one of your friends who got murdered by what thing was that scared you all in the first place. We are starting to see more and more games trending towards that concept of Lethal Company. And it's basically impossible for a game like Lethal Company to get as popular as it is without several development teams across the industry going, hey, that's a good idea. Let's see if we can make something like that. One that happened more recently is called Content Warning. That was a game that basically came out for free for a day on, I think it was on April 1st. It was like April Fool's, here's a free game. But it is actually a real video game that people can play and have some fun with. And we've seen some elements of like Lethal Company style gameplay, mostly indie games that are latching onto it right now. But I fully expect that's going to be the sort of thing that somebody at some point is going to try to make a AAA version of that concept of gameplay. So I would keep an eye out for that sort of co-op comedy horror aspect. And then on the other side of the coin, Alan Wake 2, this was a game that took the concept of horror as a, not so much jump scares, not so much like things jumping out at you, though there certainly were jump scares in Alan Wake 2, but it was more that cerebral horror, that psychological horror that comes from things. And that's a genre that's been around for a while. Like people have been making games with psychological horror elements for a long time. But I think the thing that sticks out to me about Alan Wake 2 and why I think that's going to start to point some more developers in the direction of making more psychological horror games and making more things that sort of scratch that, like, oh, that's creepy and weird part of your brain, is just the reaction to Alan Wake 2 and the fact that there are so many people who do not consider themselves horror fans who have been very much into Alan Wake because it really pulls together the storytelling side of it. It has a story. It has a very invested story. It's one that you really can get into. The fact that it's connected to the whole Remedyverse thing in games like Control, and even like tying in things like Max Payne into it, essentially through the Alex Casey character. That is also something that people have really gravitated towards with it. But it's the sort of game that I think a lot of people would look at and say, oh, actually, psychological horror can be for more people than just the ones who want to be scared, right? It can be an element that you can include in other games and to great effect in those other games that you don't necessarily sit down and think of Alan Wake as a horror game. I think of it more as like a story-based game, a narrative-driven game. But it does have a lot of psychological horror elements to it. So those are some ideas for what I think the next trends in gaming are likely to be. It is important to note, as part of this whole discussion, though, just the state of the gaming industry currently. We are in a situation right now where making risky games is almost impossible for AAA developers. It's very, very difficult to get the funding necessary. AAA developers, or larger indie studios, I should say. It's very difficult to get the funding necessary to make something risky, to make something out of the box, to make something that's a bit different than what you've seen before right now, because the gaming industry is in a state where like major publishers don't want to take risks. Venture capitalists don't want to take risks. No one wants to put their money towards something that they're not sure is absolutely going to get them a net result, which is part of why we're seeing from AAA. We're seeing so many AAA developers, I should say. We're seeing so many samey things. So many oh, we're going to come out with this sequel to this game and that's about it. And we're canceling all these other projects and we're not working on these interesting new things anymore because we need to stick to what is safe. And safe is ultimately a little bit boring in terms of new ideas and stuff. That said, the fact that AAA developers aren't working as much on these crazy out of the box ideas is actually creating a lot of opportunity for smaller independent teams or even solo developers to come up with stuff that just really dives into that concept of, we're just going to try something very different. Here's something weird and different, and we're just going to try for it. That's a huge part of why Lethal Company took off so much, in my opinion, is because it was just something interesting and new and different amidst a sea of games that were the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. And it was really a good opportunity and a good timing on this single developer to be able to come out with a game that was so different from things at a time where gamers were just hungry for that. Gamers are really looking for something new and different. And I think we're starting to see a lot more sort of differentiation in that regard from indie developers, which is honestly, it's very reassuring for the future of the gaming industry. AAA development might be screwed for quite a while still. We don't know how long this current lull in funding for these major developments is going to continue to be a problem. But that means that there's this opportunity for more interesting ideas to come out of smaller developers and smaller development teams. So that's actually really, it's kind of the silver lining of the current issues with the gaming industry, is that indie developers are getting much more of an opportunity to really shine and really embrace different concepts because AAA isn't doing it. Anyway, hopefully that was something that was moderately approaching an answer to that question. I'm going to move on. Next question comes from Moonanites, who says, I'd be curious as to your thoughts on when it's okay for game devs to tell a player that they have to do something in order to receive a reward. I've seen the player base increasingly complain and push back against having to do any content that they deem mandatory, despite still wanting the rewards. And they went on in this question to talk a bit about Torghast and Mythic Plus and how in this commenter's opinion, they didn't feel that those were asking too much of players to do 2 Wings of Torghast a week. or to do like a plus 15 key each week to get the maximum result for Mythic Plus. At least for this player, that was just extra context on where this question is coming from. And obviously, there's been huge questions and discussions around like quote unquote mandatory content, especially in a game like World of Warcraft or in any game where there's a lot of progression elements to it and where the focus and the core gameplay is essentially improving your character and leveling up and getting more powerful over time. I use leveling up in the broad sense, not literally just increasing your player level, but like increasing your general character power. As I'm talking about that, and the problem that I have with the whole discussion around whether or not content should be quote unquote mandatory or not is that I think it's kind of missing the point. It's kind of tangential to what's actually the problem here. The problem isn't that content can be mandatory. Like if you want to give rewards, there needs to be a way to earn those rewards. If you as a player want to have a game where you earn rewards, and it's clear that that is something that gamers want, because so many games nowadays, like if a game doesn't give rewards for doing something, players feel like it's a waste of time. They feel like they need to be progressing themselves in this, even though it's a video game and it's a waste of time in the first place. The literal entire core reason that video games exist is to be a fun way to waste time. It feels like a worse waste of time if you're not getting some sort of reward for it. That's just the state of how video games are these days. There needs to be some sort of progression, some sort of unlocks, some sort of like little dopamine hits of I completed a task and I got a reward for it, or else people just don't enjoy video games as much anymore. It's kind of sad, honestly, but that's the state that we're in. So the concept of whether or not content is mandatory, I think is a bit of you're focusing on the wrong issue when you're worried about whether or not something is required to earn something. The actual issue is what is the nature of the mandatory content, right? So people have been talking about Plunderstorm. I've been talking about Plunderstorm a lot lately. I think the issue with Plunderstorm's rewards wasn't that it was like mandatory to do Plunderstorm to get this thing. It was that here's a thing people want and they don't enjoy Plunderstorm. So there needed to be some other method by which to earn those rewards, in my opinion. I don't think unique rewards for a game mode that is a limited time PvPvE surprise release thing that are so out of the box and so different from everything else that's currently available in World of Warcraft. I think that was sort of the core of the issue there. And whether or not like that is a big enough problem to be worried about is kind of a separate topic. That's a completely different thing to worry about, I think, is like, how bad is it that these rewards were only available through this particular perspective? But I think the core of the issue isn't it was mandatory to do Plunderstorm to get these rewards. The core of the issue was I don't like Plunderstorm, right? If you were a player who was upset that Plunderstorm was mandatory to get these, the issue was that you didn't like Plunderstorm. And I think it's important to focus on what is actually upsetting you and what is actually a problem. And the reason I say that is because I don't think people were upset that they had to spend an amount of time per week to like earn their legendary progression in Torghast, or sorry, in Shadowlands. They weren't upset that there was some amount of time necessary to put into the game to get legendaries. They were upset that they didn't like Torghast being that thing, right? The issue wasn't that you have to spend time to earn things in World of Warcraft. The issue was they didn't want to do Torghast. They didn't enjoy it, and that wasn't something that they wanted to do. And it also it ended up feeling like a weekly chore as opposed to something that you actually wanted to do and that you're actually feeling progression from. And that all boils down to the nature of how the content exists and the nature of whether it's fun or not, and whether or not the rewards that you're getting feel rewarding enough for what you're actually doing. I think a big part of why Torghast ended up feeling like a chore for so many people was because they got bored of Torghast long before they got the rewards they wanted from it, right? It was a pacing problem more than anything else. They felt the need to continue, and there was the need to continue to do Torghast over and over and over and over and over again, long after the flavor had been lost, long after you were no longer enjoying that content and no longer enjoying doing it. And obviously where that point exists for people is very different. There are going to be people who enjoyed Torghast the entire time. There are going to be people who never wanted to step foot in there in the first place. They went into it as part of their intro sequence. They're like, dang, I never want to do that again. And so as soon as they were asked to do that twice a week, that became a chore for them immediately. Whereas the people who just really enjoyed Torghast all the way up to that, maybe they never felt like it was a chore. Maybe they literally never felt like this was actually like a task that they had to do. It was something they were excited to go in and play some Torghast and get a reward. So it's important to recognize that where that falls for players is on a sliding scale of sorts. That said, for Torghast, I think it was fairly clear just by the response from the wider community that Torghast was something that more players felt like it fell on the chore side of things than not, right? For more players, it dragged on too long than anything else. But I think that's a big part of what you need to think about with this is it's not necessarily the problem that there was a reward for doing a thing, right? There has to, especially in a game like World of Warcraft, where the whole point of the game is to earn rewards and to progress your character. There has to be some sort of task to actually accomplish that. And if you tried to distill it down into like, just do anything, this is another example that I've seen from people before. Like, why not have literally everything reward some currency, and then you can go and just spend that currency on whatever rewards it is that you want, so that all of the rewards cost this currency and everything in the game you can do earns that currency. The problem with that is invariably, without fail, 100% of the time, there will be a best way to earn that currency, which means that all of the other methods, or at least a majority of the other methods, then feel like you are wasting your time because you're not earning that currency as fast, right? So if you had this like golden tchotchke, we'll call it, and you needed X golden tchotchkes to get any specific rewards, and you just figured out that the fastest way to earn golden tchotchkes was pet battles, everyone would do pet battles, even if they hated it, because it was faster. That's just the nature of how video games are. That's just the nature of how that works. And worse, you would end up feeling like you were wasting your time doing dungeons instead to earn your golden tchotchkes, because you weren't earning them as fast as your friend who was just spamming pet battles constantly. You would feel dumb for doing the intentionally slower method of earning this thing, because again, the whole core point of the game is to advance your character. If everything gets tied into one currency and everything has completely linear progression, then everything contributes to earning the same rewards in some way. There's still going to be a fastest way to do that, and that just doesn't work. That does not work out in practice. There have been games that have tried that in the past, and exactly what I just described is what occurred. So I don't think the problem is that occasionally content becomes mandatory to earn a specific reward. I think the concept of it being mandatory or not is it's just you're missing the point. If that's what you're honing in on, like, oh, I have to do this content. The problem isn't that you have to do that content. The problem is that it's content you don't want to do. And so analyze why you don't want to do that content instead of analyzing that you don't want to do that content, right? Think about why that is. Think about what it is about that that's making it not fun for you. And that is a more reasonable way to approach things. Because realistically, like, World of Warcraft is never going to be a game that just goes, oh, okay, yeah, we'll just make all of the rewards available to everyone all of the time for no reason, like, without having to do anything. Like, you're always going to have to do something to earn rewards. And I don't see people complaining that they have to kill raid bosses to get raid loot. Like, outside of some cases in the past where it's been like, well, it sucks that the only way to get like tier sets, for example, and that was, even then, that came about because getting the set bonuses was so substantial for your gameplay that it felt like this reward is so big that I need to do this thing that I don't otherwise want to do in order to get it. So it's a question of scaling the reward to the amount of time that you need to spend on the thing and to the nature of how many people on average are enjoying this content and so on. And there's also like, there's just going to be cases in that where sometimes the result is that you fall on the low end of the spectrum for how long you want to put into something. And that just means that no matter what, like, even if everything is properly and perfectly designed, that means that you are going to get bored of this faster than other people. At which point you will then be upset that this content is now mandatory. That's the nature of video games. That's the nature of fun being subjective. That's the nature of sometimes what's fun for one person isn't fun for another. Anyway, hopefully that kind of answered that question. I really think it's important to look at this not from the perspective of, is content mandatory, yes or no? Because it's not nearly that like black and white of a description. It's not nearly that like binary of a problem. It's more a question of, at what point does the effort needed to acquire this reward outpace how well I feel rewarded for doing it? And at what point am I so bored with doing this content that it now feels like I'm having to do it to get the reward that I want instead of enjoying my time playing the video game? Those are the better questions to be asking than whether or not something is or is not mandatory. All right, moving on. The last question for today comes from Midnight TV, who said, when you were doing TankSpot /PSD /Weekly Marmot, were you ever contacted by Blizzard regarding the status of the game? If so, what did you discuss? So I like this question because it gives me a good opportunity to, I've been doing this a lot lately, a good opportunity to be like, yeah, it doesn't really work that way. A lot of people seem to think that, like, especially when you're talking about working with content creators, you're talking about working with like having a game development team that's approaching specific members of the community to get their feedback and so on. There's always this sort of, well, there always has been, at least from some people, this expectation that that is development team turns up with list of questions and says, hello, we are here to get your feedback on this list of things. What do you think we should do here? And it's usually not that cut and dry. There are obviously cases, and there have been cases where this is usually the sort of thing that happens when you have like a influencer summit or a content creator summit. Summit tends to be a word that gets used for this sort of thing, where you bring a bunch of people out because you're like, hey, we've got some interesting stuff to show you, and we want to get feedback from a group of people. That's not quite the same as going to one specific player or one specific content creator and saying, what do you think about this specific thing? That sort of stuff does happen, but it tends to be much more casual, much less formal, much more of a like, I have formed a friendship / relationship with someone on the development team and they're curious what my thoughts are. That's not Blizzard approaching this person and saying, what do you think about this? We have now incorporated what this content creator thinks into our strategy for how to develop this video game. That sort of thing can happen, but usually only at like smaller studios. It's not really something that can be that core at a team as large as Blizzard Entertainment. So the reason I say all that is thinking back specifically to the TankSpot, Weekly Marmot, etc. days. That was something where, yes, we did. I had lots of discussions with various people at Blizzard, a bunch of people who worked at TankSpot, like Ciderhelm and so on. We would have conversations with people at Blizzard, but they were much less formal. They were the case where like occasionally there would be like a round of interviews that would occur, and we'd be talking to the community team at the time to figure out like, okay, cool, can we be part of this? Or more accurately, they would approach us and say, hey, you've been invited to be part of this. And we'd be like, great, who are we going to talk to? And then we'd figure it out from there. There were people on the community team that I would talk to more regularly. Like back then, it would be people like Bashiok and Zarheim. Those were people that I was talking to, not like constantly. We weren't like, Discord didn't exist back then, but like it wasn't that sort of nature of a relationship. It was more of a like, hey, here's a thing that I'm doing. I'm going to send an email to somebody, and then we can have like a brief email conversation about that. But it was more like, here's like talking about like, hey, I'm going to do my 100th Weekly Marmot episode. Let's figure out if there's something we can do about that, some way to like get a retweet from the Warcraft account, that sort of thing. And the nature of the relationship with the community team, at least back then, usually was more along those lines of like, how can they support content creators as opposed to how can content creators give feedback on the game? These were the days where I first started talking to Greg Street, Ghostcrawler, and started to become friends with Ghostcrawler because he was just a fan of TankSpot. I still remember there was this great experience where I got invited to, I believe it was the Mist of Pandaria press event. I got invited out to Blizzard campus, and we were all sitting in the cafe. And I had seen Ghostcrawler, but like he didn't know what I looked like. I hadn't really. God, this might have been prior to Mist of Pandaria, actually. Might have been earlier than that, because I had not started doing video content with my face and everything in it by that point. I had not done the Weekly Marmot yet when this occurred. So we were sitting at this table. God, when was it? I'm gonna have to sit down and think about exactly when that was. We were sitting at this table, and I was talking to someone else whose name I can't recall. They were someone who left Blizzard shortly after I started. I don't remember who it was I was talking to, but it was like I said something about TankSpot, and the person I was talking to was, oh, TankSpot, yeah, I use your site. And Greg just went, wait, did you say you're Lore from TankSpot? Like turned to look at me, like dropped whatever other. I felt so bad because he was in the middle of a conversation with somebody else. He just dropped that and turned to me like, wait, you're Lore from TankSpot? Hi. I'm like, hi, Greg. Yeah, how's it going? We've been talking a little bit here and there. It was super funny. But that was the nature of what those sort of relationships were back then. It was, and still continues to be to this day. There are still people who just have friends that work at Blizzard on various things, or will occasionally talk to people, and like, it's not so much a hello, you have been invited to give feedback on this thing at Blizzard all of the time. Most of the time when those conversations are taking place, it's much more like someone just sends an email that says, hey, Ian, I'm upset about this thing and here's why it doesn't work. And then they might have a little conversation and that's about it. There's a lot of things that, again, mostly the community team ends up doing that are focused on, let's get it like a group of people together. Let's work with these content creators. And oftentimes, like a big part, once I was working with content creators and I was heading up the influencer strategy for World of Warcraft for a while, a lot of my time was spent gathering feedback from content creators so that I could then take that to the development team and sort of let them feel like I was their guy on the inside, that they could be like, hey, I'm really upset about this specific thing, and here's why it doesn't work. And so then I would be able to sit and have a two-way, because I had the time to sit and have a two-way conversation with them about like, okay, let me make sure that I fully understand this so that then I can go to the design team and explain what the actual issue was. Because oftentimes members of the design team, they're working on the video. It's not their job to talk to content creators. It's their job to make the video game. And so because my job was to talk to content creators, I was able to spend the time having that discussion with them to get to the core of what the issue is. Whereas a designer wouldn't necessarily be able to set aside that part of their workday to sit down and really analyze an issue and really dig into an issue so that they could understand the core of it. It would more be the case of like, I don't understand this problem, so I'm just going to not worry about it or whatever. So that was one thing that I was able to facilitate a lot as a member of the community team. I have gone way on a tangent with the reaction or with the response to this question. But hopefully that helps resolve. Hopefully that helps answer it a little bit. There's a ton of conversation. There's lots of content creators who are able to talk to. There's lots of even just players who are able to talk to members of the development, the members of the development team. I need to end this episode before my face completely falls apart. There's discussions. They happen. Sometimes they're very formal. Sometimes they're very not. Back when I was doing TankSpot and PSD and the Weekly Marmot, it fell a lot more on the very not formal side of things. That's how things worked back then. And it still continues to exist to some extent nowadays. Anyway. Blah. All right. That was a lot of brain that I just used trying to get through all of that. Thank you so much for watching. Again, we're going to be doing some, especially on Thursday this week, we're going to be doing some War Within beta dungeons. I'm going to try to do those with viewers as much as possible. We'll do that on Thursday this week. So check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Devilore, and join that Sounds Good community in the War Within beta on the These Go to 11 server if you can. And again, the invite link for that, or the invite code for that, is down in the description below here on YouTube. Yeah, I think that's about all. Oh, and a reminder, if you want to ask a question to be answered here on the show, the way to do that is just leave a comment here on YouTube, or if you're a patron, you can either leave a comment on the Patreon posting for this, or there's a form that you can fill out that will let you like say what you want me to call you on the show and so on. You can use that form as well to send in your questions. And patrons do get first priority for having questions answered here on the show. That is one of the perks of the Patreon. Anyway, I'm out of here. Thanks again so much, everybody, for watching. I'll see you later.